Hey everyone, so this is a quick disclaimer. This video is a re-upload because YouTube age restricted the original one. I did leave it unlisted, which means that if you have the link, you can still watch it. But I did unfortunately have to tweak some stuff. And if you guys are aware of YouTube's age restriction policies, they don't actually tell you which part of the video violated guidelines. So I may or may not have gone a little overboard with cutting some stuff out. But that's it, so I hope you guys enjoy the video. Welcome back everyone. Today we are beginning our journey into the second layer of the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg created by Jimboseth. If you are new to the series, we only recently finished the first layer of this 1,000+ entry juggernaut of an iceberg. In that first layer, we covered famous topics like the Zodiac Killer, as well as lesser known subjects such as the Velisca Axe murders and the Unfavorable Semicircle YouTube channel. And as we dive deeper, these subjects will only become more heinous and obscure. So for those of you who are new, I'll link the playlist with the previous 5 parts in the description, and without further ado, let's begin layer 2 of the ultimate Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. Our first entry of layer 2 is focusing on the abduction of 74-year-old Violet Ripkin on the morning of July 24th, 2002. Violet entered her garage only to find a man armed with a handgun waiting for her. From there, the mystery man would bound and blindfold the elderly woman as he shoved her into the back seat of her silver sedan. Almost 12 hours after Violet had been abducted, a couple would see the silver sedan pull into a small neighborhood where the abductor would then step out of the vehicle. Immediately, the couple were suspicious of the man as he was seen wearing thick gloves in temperatures that exceeded 90 degrees. Furthermore, they could faintly make out the silhouette of an older woman with what looked to be a mask over her head. When the strange man was questioned as to what he was doing, he simply replied, "That's my mother, she's got Alzheimer's." Immediately after saying that, the man would dive back into the silver sedan and peel out back onto a nearby freeway. The couple, now 100% convinced that they had just witnessed something sinister, would urgently dial 911 and give the dispatcher the license plate number. And it turned out that the vehicle actually belonged to Cal Ripkin Jr., who is an MLB Hall of Famer, having played for the Baltimore Orioles for about 2 decades. And it just so happened that the abducted Violet Ripkin was the mother of Cal. Police began scouring the vicinity in search of the vehicle, as well as investigate Violet's home, where they found nothing out of the ordinary. They would then visit the neighbors, asking if they had witnessed anything unusual. One of the residents said she had seen a pickup truck parked on their street a few days earlier that normally wasn't there. At this point, authorities had yet to announce Violet Ripkin's disappearance, but on the next day, they gave a press briefing, making the topic public. And this is where the case gets kind of weird. A 28-year-old neighbor of Violet's named Eric Snyder had to take an odd route back home on the 25th. On this alternate path home, he would come across the silver sedan that police had spoken of at the press briefing earlier that day. And inside, he could see an elderly woman waving a towel from the slight crack in the window, as well as hear honking from the car. Eric would then contact authorities and they would successfully return Violet home. So now the question here is why? Why was Violet left all alone? Was this intentional, or was the mystery abductor intending on returning for Violet? And just who was he? Violet was completely unharmed and even said that the man was actually pretty respectful. He initially wanted to toss Violet into the trunk, but after she had begged him not to because of her claustrophobia, he agreed and had her seated in the back of the vehicle. Violet would further elaborate and say that they frequently stopped for food, and he even lit cigarettes for her. The police were able to track the exact route that the man had taken based on eyewitness accounts of seeing the silver sedan, but no matter how they twisted the details, they couldn't come up with any sort of reasoning for the abduction of Violet besides money. In Violet's vehicle, there were various baseball-related items, and speculators believe these to be the reason why the man abandoned Violet. These items may have sparked some sort of conversation where the man learned that Violet's son was a successful baseball player in the MLB. He may have mistook her as some sort of low-profile, rich older woman with no knowledge that she was connected to a high-profile individual like her son. To this day, the identity and the true motive of the abductor is still a mystery. For billions of people around the world, February 14th, Valentine's Day, is celebrated with flowers and the company of a loved one. This was especially so for Harold and Asha Degree, who were married on that exact date. Unfortunately though, their love would never be the main focus of their Valentine's days ever again. Asha Degree was a 9-year-old girl from Shelby, North Carolina who went missing on February 14th in the year of 2000. Asha would pack her backpack and leave her home early in the morning despite the intense rain and wind outside. It is unknown why she decided to do this, and it's just completely baffling that such a young girl would go out all alone at night in such terrible weather. Asha's parents would discover that she had gone missing later in the morning when they woke up. Asha's brother, whose name is O'Brien and was 10 at the time, says he recalls Asha's bed squeaking but thought nothing of it, as he thought she was simply shifting positions in bed. Supposedly, this was the moment when Asha had packed her stuff and left the house. Around 4 to 4:30 a.m., several vehicles said they saw a little girl walking along Highway 180, and a trucker even decided to circle around a few times as he became worried. Obviously, it's not every day that you're going to see a little girl walking around at night. And it seems that Asha may have caught on to what the trucker was doing, as on the third circle, she would bolt into a heavily wooded area nearby. Although we don't know if this was because of the trucker or if it was just a means to get out of the rain, or maybe there was some other reason that she ran inside the woods. Asha's mother, Akila, woke up around 6 a.m. and would go into the children's rooms around 6:30 a.m. to get them ready for school. O'Brien would show up without issue, but Asha, as we know, would fail to be present. At first, Akila would ask her husband Harold if he knew where she was. Harold would say no and then suggest that she may have crossed the street to visit her grandmother's house. But once Akila called the house to check, she would find out that Asha was in fact not there. This would understandably send Akila into a panic. She would call the police, then put on her shoes and storm outside calling out to Asha. By 7 a.m., police would begin arriving at the Degree household, and they would utilize police dogs to try and grab the missing girl's scent, but failed. A handful of volunteers, as well as the family themselves, would spend their day in search of Asha, and in the end, all they could find was a small mitten, which Akila doubted even belonged to her daughter, as all her winter clothing was still in the house. The next day, candy wrappers, a pencil, a marker, and a Mickey Mouse shaped hair bow would be found near the wooded area where Asha was last seen. At first, this may have seemed like a ray of hope, but investigators would soon announce that these wouldn't help at all in locating the girl's whereabouts. The search continued for another week before being called off. The county sheriff, Dan Crawford, urged that the public and the media keep the story alive. A convicted sex offender by the name of Marcus Mellon wrote a letter to the FBI that supposedly had critical information regarding Asha Degree. In the letter, Marcus said that he knows both Asha's whereabouts as well as what had happened to her. Marcus further stated that Asha had been killed and he knows what city she is currently in. The FBI didn't take Mellon's letter too seriously, but nevertheless, they treat every bit of information they get with care. And as far as I know, the interview that the FBI had with Marcus didn't result in any new worthwhile findings. Over a year after the girl's disappearance, some construction workers discovered her backpack about 30 miles from where she was last seen. However, authorities wouldn't release information regarding the contents of the bag until a number of years later, and the following list contains all of the details that I was able to find out about the backpack. The backpack was doubled bagged using black trash bags. It was buried under debris. It contained some items that belonged to Asha, as well as items that were not known to belong to her. And the contents did include a t-shirt and a children's book. However, these are not the full contents of the backpack. And you may be asking yourself if the backpack or the trash bags yielded any fingerprints, and from what I could find, the trash bags did have some partial fingerprints, but they couldn't be used in any meaningful way. And when I was researching the theories regarding Asha's case, it seemed as though her family were pretty good people. Harold and Akila tried to occupy their children with school, homework, sports, and such in order to keep them away from any heinous activities in the streets. Additionally, it seemed like the marriage between Harold and Akila was going pretty well. They didn't really have any sort of heated arguments that would cause stress onto the children. So with all that in mind, most investigators would rule out the possibility that Asha ran away simply because she was upset with the family. Another theory regarding Asha is that she was being groomed, and on the morning that she ran away, she was picked up by said groomer near the woods. And the items that did not belong to Asha actually belonged to a previous victim of the culprit. Of course, there isn't actually any evidence to back this, and it's just a theory for now. And as I said earlier, the complete contents of the bag have never been revealed as far as I know, but one of the people on the construction site, named Terry Fleming, said the following: "It was strange enough to make me uncomfortable," insinuating that whatever else was in the backpack that he saw was probably really unsettling. The Atlas Vampire is the moniker given to an unknown murderer from Sweden in 1932, and we will be discussing material that involves SA, so if that's something you won't be comfortable with, feel free to use the timecodes at the very bottom of the screen to skip ahead. A 32-year-old S-worker named Lily Lindstrom would be found dead in her tiny apartment in the Atlas area of Stockholm on May 4th, 1932. The neighboring residents in the apartment began reporting a slight pungent odor coming from Lily's room, and by the time police broke into her apartment, she had already been deceased for about 3 to 4 days. Authorities found Lily completely nude and face down on her bed and said she had suffered from blunt force trauma. It was clear that Lily was SA'd, as a condom would be found protruding from one of her orifices. Along with the condom, police found a ladle in the same room, and after further inspection of the body, they had realized Lily had been completely drained of her blood. At this point, investigators were trying to connect the dots as to how Lily had died, as there was almost no blood left over anywhere. This would then lead to them suspecting that the culprit had either drunk all of it or stored it, hence the name the Atlas Vampire. 9 known clients of Lily's would be under suspicion, but their names would never be released, and not a single one would be charged with the murder. The last person who had seen Lily was a co-worker named Minnie Jansen. Minnie would tell authorities that Lily stopped by her apartment a few days before her death to get condoms, but aside from that, she had no idea what Lily was doing before she was murdered. The Highway of Tears is a 450-mile stretch of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Canada. This highway has been host to many disappearances and murders dating all the way back to 1970, and authorities normally result this long-standing string of crimes to poverty, drug abuse, and widespread domestic violence. The general population in this area suffers from poverty, so many are unlikely to own vehicles, so they would have to resort to walking or hitchhiking to get around. And obviously, this just creates a lot of opportunities for people to go missing. Furthermore, the area is pretty isolated, with quite a few carnivorous animals roaming around that could carry away human remains that are left behind. All of these factors create a setting ideal for serial killers and abductors, as they can get a sense of privacy and power, so to speak, with no one being immediately available to stop them. There have been a very large amount of people convicted in cases that are related to the Highway of Tears, many of which are serial killers, such as Brian Peter Arp, Edward Isaac, and Cody Lejbikoff, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, as well as Bobby Fowler. And being that the disappearances have been reported on the highway since the 70s, there are much too many to go over in this video. I believe the amount of missing or murdered women alone goes over 40, but they more or less all play out in similar ways, where an individual will be last seen in a relatively secluded location alone before going missing and then being found dead. For example, in 2013, 26-year-old Mary Basil would last be seen walking alone in the middle of the night. Mary was the mother of a 5-year-old boy and had recently broken up with the father of said child. Mary would go out one night to attend a house party that was relatively close to her home. In fact, you could make the journey on foot. Mary wouldn't stay at the party for very long, and she would head to a cabin in the Leo Creek area, and it was reported that she was accompanied by her cousin Keith and another man named Victor. The truck that the trio used to get to the cabin would suddenly break down, and for whatever reason, Mary decided to go to the cabin alone while the other two men stayed with the truck. A few days later, Mary's sister would call the RCMP after not receiving a call from her. The RCMP's first suspects were, of course, Keith and Victor, who were the last people known to have been with Mary. Both men would take polygraph tests and they would both pass. Furthermore, they were both subject to an interview/interrogation by a police psychologist, and in the end, the police would report that they were not suspicious at all. However, there was something strange that was reported by a few witnesses. They would say that they saw Victor walking down a road around 10 a.m. the morning after Mary went missing. Additionally, his clothes were completely drenched in water all the way up to his chest. To this day, Mary's body has never been found, and there have been no other suspects brought to attention regarding her case. On February 10, 2009 in Quebec, 14-year-old David Fortin would go missing on his way to school. Around 7 to 8 a.m., David asked his mother Caroline for a ride to school, where she told David that she was busy and couldn't drive him. David wouldn't ask again and instead just put on his jacket and grabbed his backpack and then left for school. But after that morning, David would never be seen again. It is not known if David was abducted or if he simply just ran away, but David's parents do believe that it's the latter. They said that David was bullied relentlessly in school ever since he was young, and that they personally believe that he ran away to escape his classmates. To make an illustration as to how bad it was, when David was around 6 years old, his grade school teachers would let him out early so that he could run home before the other kids got out to catch him. On one occasion in 2008, David was being chased by a group of about 20 people who backed David into a dead end. From there, they took David's bike and began beating him. Somehow, he would be able to flee out of the dead end and reach his cousin's house, where he would call the police. When David reached the home of his cousin, whose name is Maxime, he was drenched in water from his waist down. Out of fear, David would lie and say that he fell into some water when in reality, he had to cross a deep creek in order to escape the bullies. But eventually, he would admit that he was being chased by bullies and being beaten. When the police arrived, they would simply tell David to ignore and leave the gang of people that he was being chased by alone. At this point, David fell into a massive pit of despair, realizing that even police were not on his side. David would begin visiting a psychiatrist, which didn't do much for him. And at this point, his mother and family were becoming increasingly worried that he would do something irrational, as he often left the home after dinner and went for long walks, likely to just reflect on his life. But in a sort of shocking turn of events, when David turned 14, the bullying actually kind of stopped. David, having had enough of the bullying, decided to fight back one day at school, resulting in him knocking a boy out. But unfortunately, this pause in bullying wouldn't last. On January 28, 2009, David's mother would call David's cousin in a panic, saying that he had not returned from school and it was almost dinner. Maxime would immediately leave his home and hop in his truck with the searchlights on to find David. After an hour or so, he would find David walking on a long road that ultimately led to a river. David had been walking for hours at this point and was shivering from the cold. Maxime would pull him into the truck and take him to a nearby McDonald's, where David would share that he has had enough and couldn't take it anymore. Without having to outright say it, Maxime knew that the bullying had returned. David's mother would not send David to school for the next few days, and it seemed that David's mood was gradually getting better being alone. But as we all know, eventually David would slip back into a very dark place. It was mentioned that David may have ran away to avoid an especially bad beating. Apparently, this situation involved a student who was playing with a fire extinguisher. David reported the student to a teacher, which resulted in the student threatening that he was going to smash David's face in. And a detail that I left out is that when David asked his mother for a ride to school, he actually crawled into his mother's bed and hugged her tightly before asking for said ride. Due to this detail, many investigators believe that David either took his own life or ran away, and this was his sort of way of saying goodbye to his mother. To this day, we have no idea what truly happened to David, but his mother still hopes that her son will be found alive despite it being years since his disappearance. This entry focuses on a lesser-known cryptid. Anjing Ajak is a giant werewolf that is said to reside in Indonesia, and just like any other werewolf in popular fiction, it has a standard human form that transforms into a large humanoid wolf. Being that this is a lesser-known subject, I couldn't find very much info on it, but it seems although it was inspired by the small mountain canine, which is also often referred to as a Ajak. So interestingly enough, this topic seems to actually have been solved earlier this year, or at the very least, half solved. Before we begin, I want to clarify that this entry in particular is referring to the Stanley Park incident, as there are actually a lot of murder cases under the name Babes in the Woods. In January of 1953, a few workers came across the remains of 2 male children that were likely killed years earlier. Investigators estimate that the bodies had been there for at least 5 or 6 years. Additionally, it would be determined that the 2 boys died from wounds in their heads from a hatchet that had also been found nearby. The investigation initially reached a standstill when medical examiners would say that one of the victims was female, but after some extra testing, it was concluded that both victims were in fact male and that the 2 were actually brothers. In 2018, detectives used DNA databases such as 23andMe to look into possible identities of the victims. In 2022, they would conclude that the children were Derek and David Dalton, who were born in 1940 and 1941 respectively. But that's pretty much where the solved portion of the case ends. It is still not known who killed the boys and for what reason. Ada Constance Kent was a wealthy spinster who lived alone in a cottage in eastern England. Ada disappeared from her cottage in the summer of 1939 without notifying anyone, and after several months with no word, her friends became concerned. One of her friends has said she searched all over her home but failed to find her or any hint as to where she could be. Police would take the investigation into their own hands and also fail in obtaining any worthwhile information. All they could find inside the cottage was a tray of leftover food and an open copy of Romeo and Juliet set by the fireplace. About 3 years later, another of Ada's friends named George Winkle would revisit the abandoned cottage in hopes that perhaps she had come back or maybe found something that everyone else had overlooked. And as you could probably guess, there was nothing yet again. It wouldn't be until 1948 where we would get our first unusual occurrence connected to Ada. Almost 9 years later, Ada's bank account would receive a large mysterious deposit, which prompted police to immediately storm Ada's home once more. What they found this time left them speechless. Inside the rundown cottage was now a fully clothed skeleton sat up next to a bed, and along with the skeleton there would be an empty bottle labeled poison. Authorities were completely baffled as to what was going on, who had left the skeleton there, and who did the skeleton even belong to. Was it really Ada? Well, I couldn't find a concise answer, but it seems although one half believes that the skeleton actually was that of Ada, while the other half says that it's impossible that it belongs to her, as it appears to be the skeleton of a male. But in the case that the skeleton really was Ada, we still have no idea what had happened to her after she left the cottage, and what was the deal with the strange deposit in her bank account. Tara Calico is a woman who disappeared in 1988 in New Mexico, and at first it was not known if she had been kidnapped or not, but very quickly authorities would have that question answered for them. On September 20th, 1988, Tara had left her home around 9:30 a.m. to begin her daily routine of riding her bike along New Mexico State Road 47. Normally, Tara would be accompanied by her mother Patty, but she had decided to stop going on these rides ever since they suspected that they were being stalked by a motorist. Patty had heavily advised Tara to carry a long mace, but Tara had enthusiastically rejected the idea. On the night before Tara went missing, she told her mother that if she didn't return home around noon, that she'd be playing tennis with her boyfriend. And after Tara failed to return home, her mother Patty would begin searching along State Road 47 for her, but she would not be able to find any sort of trace of her. After her lone search, Patty would then contact the police, who found pieces of Tara's Sony Walkman and a cassette tape along the road. Several people would inform police that they did see Tara riding her bike that morning, but had no recollection that she had been abducted or stepped into any vehicle. Additionally, authorities were not able to find her bicycle at all. Almost a year later, in June of 1989, a Polaroid photo of a young woman and a boy would be discovered in a parking lot in Florida. The woman who had stumbled across the image had said that it was accidentally left behind by a windowless Toyota cargo van and was being driven by a man with a mustache in his 30s. Police would attempt to stop the vehicle by setting up roadblocks, but unfortunately this effort would prove fruitless and the man would never be identified. When experts viewed the photograph, they would determine that it had been taken after May of 1989, as the film used in the picture was not available until then, which if true would mean that Tara is more than likely still alive at this point. The photo would make its rounds on news channels all across the US, and eventually Tara's mother, Patty, would see it and say that she was convinced that the girl was indeed Tara. Furthermore, relatives of a Michael Henley would get in contact with police and say that they believed the boy in the picture to be Michael. Michael Henley had also been abducted in the New Mexico area earlier. However, it should be noted that there is some disagreement on whether or not the boy in the picture is actually Michael. In 1998, Tara would officially be declared dead and her death would be ruled as a homicide. About 2 decades after her disappearance, Valencia County Sheriff Rene Rivera would come out and say that he believes 2 teenagers could have been responsible for her disappearance. He would go on and say that the duo may have accidentally run into Tara's bike and caused serious injury. In fear of being caught, they would move Tara into their truck and get the help of 2 more men to quote-unquote dispose of her. Moreover, he thinks it's very likely Tara is buried somewhere in Valencia County. But Rivera would never give the names of the suspects or speak any further on the case in order to not give away any tips to the culprits in case they had caught wind. Tara's family would eventually become very frustrated with Rivera for not taking action after saying such things. And as of today, there have been no arrests made in this case and it remains open. Siberian orange snow was an unusual phenomenon that occurred in February of 2007. The orange-tinted snow began falling in late January and was described as being oily and pungent, and it had 4 times the normal amount of iron in it. The snow would affect approximately 27,000 residents, and it is unclear what had caused the orange snow, but one theory suggests that it was due to a heavy sandstorm in Kazakhstan. After testing some of the snow, it was found that they had slight traces of sand and dust particles inside. Another theory suggests that the colorful snow was caused by industrial pollution as it contained significantly more acid, nitrates, and iron. The Alphabet Murders are a series of murders involving children that took place between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. And in case you haven't heard of this topic before, it does involve children and assault, so if you don't think you're going to be comfortable with that, use the time codes at the very bottom to skip ahead. The Alphabet Murders totaled 3 victims, all of which were girls aged 10 or 11 whose surname all began with the same letter as their first name. The girls were named Carmen Colin, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza. All 3 of the girls were SA'd and died by strangulation. The culprit would discard the bodies near small towns or villages around Rochester, and these towns or villages also shared the same first letter as the victim's name. 10-year-old Carmen disappeared around 4 p.m. on November 16, 1971, after completing an errand that her grandmother had sent her on. Customers and staff of the pharmacy Carmen had visited said the girl stepped into a car parked outside after she was told that the prescription she requested had not been processed yet. Almost an hour after Carmen had left the pharmacy, she could be seen completely naked running down a street in panic. Carmen was waving her arms around and screamed out for help as a dark-colored pickup truck was reversing to catch up to her. Carmen would ultimately be captured and led back into the truck before she could escape or get any help from anyone. A couple days later, 2 teenagers would discover the lifeless body of Carmen ditched in a gully near Interstate 490, which was about 10 miles from where she was last seen. Her autopsy would reveal that Carmen had been raped. Furthermore, one of her vertebrae as well as her skull were fractured, and she ended up dying by manual strangulation. Rightfully so, this incident gained national attention and immense outrage as no one had attempted to help the little girl earlier when she was screaming running around. In the months that followed, police interrogated a handful of suspects, but they would all be released and cleared of any involvement. Police announced that there was a cash reward for any information that led to the arrest of the culprit or culprits, and as time went on, local businesses and residents also made donations, contributing to the reward. As 1971 gradually crept to an end, there would be these large billboards asking, "Do you know who killed Carmen?" alongside major expressways, but despite getting numerous anonymous leads, they would all result in nothing. Over a year and a half later, we would get our case with 11-year-old Wanda Walkowicz, who was on her way home after being sent to buy groceries. Wanda was reported to have been sighted inside a store around 5 p.m. and her mother Joyce would call the police at 8 p.m. after Wanda failed to return home. Nearly 50 detectives were sent to search the area between the store and Joyce's home, but the search wouldn't yield any clues. A handful of neighborhood residents would say that they saw Wanda struggling with her bag of groceries, and specifically she was seen trying to support the bag against the fence with her knee to adjust her grip. Around 12 to 13 hours later on the following day, Wanda's fully clothed body was found at the base of a hill alongside a road leading to State Route 104. Just like Carmen, it was clear that Wanda had been raped and then strangled to death. Along Wanda's body were also a few defensive wounds indicating that she tried her best to fight off the attacker and escape. The way her body was found led authorities to believe that she had been tossed out of a moving vehicle after being reclothed. An anonymous eyewitness would say that they saw Wanda standing in front of the passenger side window of a brown vehicle speaking with the driver, but the way the vehicle was parked made it impossible to get a clear view of the occupant. In November of the same year, 11-year-old Michelle Maenza would also go missing. Michelle had always arrived home on time after school, so once she failed to do this, her mother instantly knew something was wrong and contacted authorities. Michelle was last seen by her friends leaving school around 3:30 p.m. A witness stated that they saw a beige or tan colored vehicle speeding down the street with a little girl crying in the passenger seat. About 2 hours after, a motorist would see the truck parked alongside Route 350 with a blown out tire. Standing right next to the vehicle was a dark-haired Caucasian man aged between 25 and 35 holding a young child by the wrist. The motorist, with nothing better to do, would stop to offer help to the man, and when this happened, the man pushed the girl behind him almost as if to try and hide her and the license plate of the vehicle. Furthermore, this man would begin showing off a menacing scowl on his face, which ultimately scared off the motorist. Michelle's body would be found 2 days later, fully clothed with the same characteristics as Carmen and Wanda. So of course there are a number of suspects in these murders, including Carmen's own uncle. A few weeks prior to Carmen's abduction, it was known that her uncle Miguel had purchased a vehicle that was strikingly similar to the one that was described by eyewitnesses. After obtaining this tip, police conducted a search of Miguel's newly purchased vehicle where they found both the exterior and interior extensively cleaned with a strong cleaning solution. Police would then reach out to the dealership that sold the car, and they said that the vehicle was not cleaned to that extent prior to the sale. Additionally, a friend of Miguel's said that Miguel told him he had plans to leave the country as he had done something wrong in Rochester. Miguel would escape to Puerto Rico, but would ultimately be extradited back to Rochester after investigators traveled to San Juan in 1972. Miguel failed to give an alibi for his whereabouts on the date of Carmen's death, and none of his friends were able to say anything to help Miguel's situation. However, despite the strong circumstantial evidence, Miguel was not able to be tied to all three of these murders. And in 1991, Miguel took his own life after he was involved in an incident where he shot both his wife and brother. And before we end off this entry, there is one more person I wanted to mention, and that is Joseph Nasso, who was convicted for raping and murdering 4 women. And if you look into this guy, you will find quite a few similarities to the case that we just mentioned. All of Joseph's victims also had first and last names that shared the same first letter. And surprisingly, one of these victims was also named Carmen Colon, but the victim that was tied to Joseph was actually a 22-year-old. But when authorities compared Joseph's DNA to the DNA evidence found in the murders of the 3 10 to 11-year-old girls, they did not match up. So I didn't have the opportunity to do an extensive deep dive into Joseph Nasso, but from what I did gather, he is not the same killer that took the lives of the 3 children that we just discussed. But if any of you guys know of this man and have come across articles or data that prove he is 100% the same person, feel free to let me know in the comments below. In 1991, a woman was found in a shower in a motel, and in 2021 it was mentioned that the woman may have been known as Becca. The cause of death was ruled as a but despite finding a photograph tied to the woman, she has never been identified. On June 3rd, 1991, around 10 p.m., a truck driver by the name of Eduardo Cullen would arrive at a Super 8 motel in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Eduardo rented a room for 2 people for a single night, and he was told to check out by 11 a.m. on the following day, but Eduardo would fail to do so, and staff wouldn't realize that he hadn't checked out until June 5th. From there, staff sent a security guard to pay a visit to Eduardo's room. The guard found that the door was locked from the inside and had to use a screwdriver to get in. Upon entering the room, he didn't notice anything unusual at first, but when he stepped into the bathroom, he was petrified by the sight of a woman from the shower head. Authorities found heroin in the woman's system, and due to the decomposition, they believed that she had died the same night that Eduardo had purchased the motel rooms. On the desk within the room, there was a picture of the woman along with the man that motel staff would confirm was Eduardo. It took several years to locate Eduardo's family, and when they were found, authorities learned that Eduardo had already died due to natural causes. The next bit is a little strange. When the family was shown the photograph, they said that the man was not Eduardo, and they had no idea who the woman was. There are many theorists that say the family purposely lied to authorities when they said the man wasn't Eduardo in an odd attempt to preserve his image or something. In addition to the photograph, police found a scale with the name George Martinez written on it. It's assumed that the scale was used to weigh packages of drugs. So, assuming the family was indeed telling the truth that the man pictured was not Eduardo, we have no idea who the man or the women pictured are. And while I did say that this was confirmed to be many internet sleuths proposed that the shower head had no way of supporting 100+ pounds, and it was actually too short, so the woman couldn't actually effectively herself from it. So what does that all mean then? Well, these people also suggested that maybe she had overdosed on heroin, and the man panicked and for whatever reason propped her body up in the shower to mimic a suicide. Richard Singer was a lawyer specializing in criminal defense and divorces. On July 9th, 1937, Richard arrived home using a taxi. The driver would step out and wrap around the vehicle to open Richard's door, but Richard would wave him off before paying his fare and letting himself out. Richard then gleefully walked to his front gates, and after stepping through, Richard was blasted by an explosion which sprayed jagged pieces of metal and debris at him. Richard was then propelled sideways where he sustained multiple injuries. Additionally, a hole had been ripped through the front door of the neighbor's home and the taxi sign had been blown off. Richard was rushed to the hospital to have his injuries treated, and fortunately, he would survive. When police and journalists questioned Richard as to what had happened, he would reply, "It was a deliberate attempt at murder. It could not have been anything else. I can conceive of no person who bears me a grudge and who would wish to do me an injury. I have not the slightest idea who was responsible for the attempt on my life. I am unable to supply the police with even the shadow of a clue." When investigators went to the site of the bombing the next day, they would be left stumped as to how the situation played out. There was no sign of a tripwire, and police had previously discarded the idea of the bomb being timed. Some of the investigators proposed that the bomb had been thrown at Richard, but the taxi driver and Richard both said that they didn't see anybody nearby. A couple weeks later, Richard received an anonymous letter saying that there may be another assassination attempt on him, but he said that he didn't take it seriously and looked at the letter as a practical joke. Over 80 years later, the mystery of who undertook the bombing attempt remains a mystery. The Baghdad Battery is the name given to a set of items that is supposedly the oldest battery in existence. The items consisted of a clay pot, a copper tube, and an iron rod. The items were uncovered just outside of Baghdad in 1936 and are believed to have been created as early as 150 BC. Now, earlier I did say that this thing is supposed to be a battery, but it's not exactly known what the true purpose of this item is. One day, scientists decided to fill the pot with vinegar and found that it produces about 1 volt. They then theorized that this pot could have been used in electroplating. But it should be mentioned that there are a lot of people that think that this is an unlikely use for the item. A number of historians believe that due to how it was constructed, the pot was actually used to store scrolls and other items. A Reddit post I came across goes over a possible use case and arguments against the pot being a battery, and it is decently long, so feel free to pause the video to go over it if you are interested. The Doodler is an unidentified serial killer that is believed to have murdered between 6 to 16 men in San Francisco, California between 1974 and 1975. And there would actually be an additional 3 men that were assaulted, but they would survive their encounter with the killer. The name of Doodler was given to the killer due to his habit of sketching his victims prior to murdering them. The culprit liked to visit restaurants, bars, and gay nightclubs to find his victims, all of which were white males that were stabbed to death. The killer is described as an African American man between 19 and 25 years of age and about 6 feet in height. The first known victim was named Gerald Kavanaugh, who was 49 years old at the time of his death. Gerald's fully clothed body was found lying face up on Ocean Beach in San Francisco with multiple self-defense wounds. Furthermore, Gerald was a single man who seemed to live alone, which was a common theme amongst most of the victims. I say most as there were at least 1 or 2 of them that did have families close by. It's not known if this was a characteristic that the killer looked for when choosing his targets though. In 1977, a police officer identified a suspect that he believed to be the Doodler. And as I said in the beginning, there were 3 people who survived their encounter with this killer. But when they were asked to testify against the suspect, they actually refused. Their reasoning was that they didn't want to out themselves by stepping into court. One of the 3 survivors was a well-known entertainer, while another was a diplomat, and since homosexuality was heavily stigmatized at the time, they feared their careers would be jeopardized if they did testify. Unfortunately, authorities said that they were more or less certain that this suspect in question was indeed the culprit, but since there was no hard evidence and no one to testify, they were forced to let the man go. To this day, the name and general information of the suspect has never been released. Additionally, there is very little information available to the public about the crimes. Most of the victims only had very brief write-ups that were like about 3 to 5 sentences, and they only gave characteristics and details such as their age and height. Agent 355 was the codename given to a female spy during the American Revolution who was supposedly also part of the Culper Ring, which was a network of spies that operated in the same time period. The true identity of Agent 355 is unknown, but she is believed to be one of the first spies working for the United States. And the actual number 355 could be decrypted in a system used by the Culper Ring to mean lady. The first and only reference to 355 was in a letter from Abraham Woodhull to George Washington, where 355 was described as an ever serviceable individual. And based on how the letter and code were structured, it's believed that this woman was one of social prominence, having at some point been in contact with people such as Benedict Arnold. One theory proposes that 355 was a woman named Anna Strong who lived nearby Abraham Woodhull. Allegedly, Anna had assisted in locating trapped or lost members of the Patriots when they failed on their raids on British shipments. Of course, there are other theories and possible identities, but some enthusiasts believe the code was actually mistranslated and this woman was not actually part of the Culper spy ring. Instead, she was just some sort of pedestrian that just so happened to help out from time to time. The Cleveland Torso Murderer was an unidentified serial killer from Cleveland, Ohio in the 1930s. The killings involved 12 known victims that were all dismembered and left in impoverished neighborhoods, but recent research has suggested that the total number of victims could range into the 20s, and as you can probably guess, the killer was given this name due to his habit of dismembering and decapitating the victims. Our killing spree began on September 23rd, 1935, when 2 teenage boys discovered the corpse of an unknown man who had been decapitated and emasculated at the base of Jackass Hill. The man's body was completely drained of blood and was left naked with rope burns along both of his wrists. This first victim still had his limbs, so authorities were able to take his fingerprints and identify him as Edward Andrazi, who was a 28-year-old white male. Furthermore, while police were investigating the crime scene, they discovered a second body in the vicinity that was also decapitated and emasculated. It's estimated that the second body had been dead for a few weeks, and authorities determined the man to be in his 40s. However, he would never be identified. And we're going to sidetrack a little here, but on the second body, there was this strange chemical preservative lathered all around that caused the skin to become red and leathery. And it turns out that this preservative is the exact same that another victim labeled as the Lady of the Lake was covered in. Moreover, she was found in the same location as the 7th victim that was tied to the torso murders. But I do want to make it clear, the Lady of the Lake has never been officially connected to the Cleveland torso murders, but because of the similarities with the preservative and the location of the body, they are often brought up together in discussions. The majority of the victims in this case have remained unidentified, and investigators determined that most of them were drifters, so they had very few, if any, reliable relations or forms of documentation that could help with finding an identity. Additionally, since the bodies were dismembered, not all of the heads or fingerprints could be retrieved, making it even more difficult to identify the bodies. About 9,000 people have been interrogated during the investigation to find a culprit, and along the way there have actually been close to 1,000 other crimes that were solved with the torso murderer suspects. And while this case is officially unresolved, most investigators believe that a man named Frank Sweeney to be the most likely suspect. Dr. Frank Sweeney was a veteran from World War I and worked in a unit that was responsible for amputations. Sweeney was a very troubled man, and once the war ended, he became an alcoholic and was plagued with pathological anxiety and depression. Furthermore, Sweeney had sustained severe nerve damage after being gassed in combat during his military service. An investigator named Elliot Ness would personally interview Sweeney and determine him to be a viable suspect despite only having circumstantial evidence. Ness believed that it would become an uphill battle if he were to try and bring Sweeney in to be prosecuted, as Sweeney's cousin was one of Ness's political opponents. And Sweeney's cousin was publicly frustrated with law enforcement at the time with how they handled the murders thus far. Eventually, Sweeney committed himself to a hospital, which resulted in an immediate stop to the murders. From the hospital, Sweeney harassed and berated Ness and his family through the use of postcards. He would die in July of 1964, but due to his surgical expertise, as well as access to ideal facilities, he remains as one of the more likely suspects.